Who wants to see a Hemi intake shootout? You know, nice little 5.7. What works better, the truck intake, a Magnum intake, or the SRT8? Let's check it out. The Gen 3 Hemi is an amazing motor with a ton of potential. Think about this. Much like the LS, the Gen 3 Hemi, whether it's a 5.7, 6.1, or 6.4, was blessed right from the factory with impressive cylinder heads and equally good induction systems. And like the LS, the only thing that's missing to transform a good motor into a great motor is cam timing. That's right, add a camshaft to any of the Hemi motors, all of a sudden, you look like a hero. But here's the question, what happens after I add the camshaft? I mean, think about this. A Gen 3 Hemi, the very worst flowing set of Gen 3 Hemi heads, the early 5.7 heads used in the Dodge Ram, flow better than the very best factory LS cathedral port heads. That's how much potential a Hemi has. But the question is, after I've installed the cam in my Gen 3 Hemi, what intake do I use? This video is all about Gen 3 Hemi induction systems. In this video, I compared 3 factory intakes to a single plane intake from Mopar Performance. The 3 factory intakes included a 5.7 truck intake, the 5.7 Magnum car intake, and the 6.1 liter aluminum SRT8 intake. So what do you think? Did they all make the same peak power? Same peak torque? Same average power? That's why we test. And because I wanted to add something, you know, a little extra to this video, I included a bonus test. In this case, it's an Edelbrock Dual-Quad carbureted Hemi intake. So why add that? Well, all Hemi guys are not the same. Some guys want to pop the hood and have something extra, you know, something that says wow. And this Dual-Quad intake does exactly that. And as we see from this test, not only does it look cool, it also performs. So check it out. First up on the dyno, our Mopar Performance single plane intake. Now it's time for the Edelbrock Dual-Quad. The first of our intakes test was run with a 5.7 liter Hemi. This thing had been modified. It had mildly ported heads and a Comp 273 cam, and I'll go ahead and put the cam specs up here so you guys can take a look at it. But it was a good combination, stock bottom end basically with the cam. And we ran it first with the Mopar Performance single plane intake, and equipped with that combination, long tube headers. We ran it with a Holly HP management system. It produced 479 horsepower and 404 foot-pounds of torque. Now here's what happened after we installed our dual-quad Edelbrock intake. Now obviously this dual-quad intake is not for everybody. It's not even something that most Hemi guys are going to look at swapping. But for a guy that's got maybe a street rod, wants to take something to Cars and Coffee, you know, make something that looks cool and is unique under the hood, a dual-quad manifold is definitely cool. And besides, a Hemi should have a dual-quad manifold anyway. So here's what happened when we installed our dual-quad intake manifold with a pair of Edelbrock carburetors on it. And as you can see, in kind of typical induction fashion, our dual-quad manifold traded horsepower for torque. Now the single-plane intake, as they normally do, made a lot of peak power at the top, past 6,000, or in this case, past 5,800. But below that, the basically dual-quad intake manifold did very well. So what it shows is that if you want to put a dual quad manifold on your Hemi and you want to make it look cool, that works really well. Not only that, not only does it look cool, but it also performs very well, especially in the RPM range where most of the guys that have an induction system like this are going to be driving. I mean, I don't know how many guys are going to be out racing around with a dual quad manifold, and if you're going to try that, I would suggest something else. But putting a dual quad on Hemi, definite yes. And obviously it performs as well as it looks. So the dual quad manifold made 463 horsepower, but look at the torque. Torque was all the way up to 420 foot-pounds. Always good. Let's get to our next test. Our second test on Hemi intake manifolds is actually run on a very small stroker. It was originally started out as a 5.7 liter, but then turned into basically a 6.1 liter, and I'll go ahead and put the bore and stroke up here. It was a scat combination. We topped it with factory heads and a very small comp cam. It was their 260 cam. So this was the single plane Mopar Performance intake manifold, and in this case we ran it carbureted actually rather than fuel injected, and it worked pretty well. On our stroker, the Mopar Performance intake produced 444 horsepower and peak torque of 410 foot-pounds. So here's what happened after we install the truck intake. Now we're going to run the truck, the Magnum, and the SRT8. So this was the truck intake manifold. As you can see, long runners on the truck definitely made more torque than that single plane Mopar Performance intake, but past 57 or 5800, the single plane actually started making more power. And we saw a difference anyway. Equipped with a truck manifold, combination produced 436 horsepower. Torque was way up to 440 foot-pounds of torque. Now let's take a look at the let's take a look at the Magnum intake, because it's probably the closest one to that truck manifold. Interestingly enough, I think that they should have used the Magnum intake on the truck, because if you take a look at this, the Magnum produced a lot more torque through the whole RPM range, all the way up past 5,000 RPM compared to the truck manifold. The Magnum intake works really well and didn't lose anything compared to the truck up at the top. So the Magnum offered 463 foot-pounds of torque, while the peak horsepower was still 436 horsepower. So that Magnum intake is probably one of my favorites for these Hemis, especially for any kind of street deal. It produces a lot of torque, so it has a good average power curve and doesn't fall off at the top. Now let's take a look at the factory performance intake, the aluminum SRT8. And the SRT8, in terms of torque, falls in between the truck and the Magnum intake, but it does produce the highest peak power, at least of the factory intakes. So equipped with the SRT8, it produced 442 horsepower, getting close to the peak output of the single plane Mopar manifold. But it did produce a lot more torque than the Mopar intake, and you can see it made peak torque later in the RPM range than either the truck or the Magnum manifold. It produced 452 foot-pounds, but did so at 4,600 RPM. So this gives you a pretty good idea of all of the factory intakes, the truck, the Magnum, and the SRT8, and how they compare to your typical single plane. You can see the single plane, not good for most street applications. I mean, it's down compared to everybody else, past 5,500 RPM. So there are better choices. That's why all these factory intakes, that's why those motors run so well. It's because the Magnum intake, the truck intake, and even the SRT8, they all work good for average power production. Let's get to our... Okay guys, what'd you think about our intake test on this little stroker Hemi? I know you want me to test the late stuff, the 6.4 liter stuff, get you the cool manifolds, and believe me, I'd love to. Now I wish I had one of those test motors and a bunch of the intakes to test, but unfortunately, all I had was this early stuff. But it makes me think about this. I love variable intake manifolds, like they have in the later Hemis. Anytime you see a test like we did, where long runners do one thing and short runners do another, the best combination is not either one of those. It's obviously both of those. So if we can get a variable runner length change, that's awesome. Same kind of thing to a lesser extent, variable plenivolume. That also works. But what about this test on our truck, our Magnum, and our SRT8? Here's my takeaway. I have no idea why Dodge didn't use the Magnum intake on the truck application. Look at all that extra torque. I mean, who doesn't want a ton more torque? I know that there would be a fitment issue with the front accessories on the truck, but they could have designed a better truck intake more like the Magnum. Are you listening, aftermarket? What about the dual quad intake? Personally, I think it looks awesome. I mean, if you look at any of the older Hemis, all the cool ones had dual quad intakes. So the newer ones look just as good. And if you pop the hood, you got dual quads, you got a cool oval intake manifold, that's nothing but good. But it just goes to show you, the right intake makes a big difference on how your Hemi performs. I'm Richard Holdner, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. I got more testing coming up.